I started this month reading an Ermine in Czernopol by Gregor von Rezzori. Rezzori wrote this book and based it off of his hometown of Czernowitz or Czernivtsi, and he changed it to Czernopol. And the city is kind of in this fraught area that has changed hands, half dozen or so times in the last 150 years. It was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It was a Romanian city. It was a Ukrainian city, and now it's in far western Ukraine. But when von Rezzori was born, it was part of Romania, I believe. He grew up in like the 20s and 30s, and this book sort of is an attempt to capture childhood in this city. He does a really good job of making the city its own character. And part of its character is this sort of feeling of it having changed hands and the identity being sort of unclear, no sense of like ownership. So there's lots of Ukrainians and Romanians and Jews and Germans populating this town. In the wake of the First World War, the city having just recently changed hands, everything's kind of up in the air, and Rezzori's trying to remember his own childhood, and he does this interesting thing where he's writing in like the plural we, describing we did this and we did that, and you're kind of left to imply that he's talking about him and his direct siblings or family, but it seems like it's more of a tool to describe childhood in general at this time. The city he creates, Czernopol, is populated by a lot of very, very interesting and fun characters. I really loved this book. He doesn't put everything in chronological order. He's sort of painting a picture more broadly, and everything is sort of building underneath. There's this kind of bubbling anti-Semitism that sort of breaks out towards the end, which clearly he was interested in because of the subjects of his other books, Memoirs of an Anti-Semite and others. They all seem to deal with this sort of childhood in a city that has an identity crisis and the sort of ghosts of anti-Semitism. And the city in this book really does come alive. There's a really great passage at the beginning where he's describing a blind man following the train tracks, just sort of leading or following wherever it leads. But in the same passage, he sort of personifies the city, and so you can sort of imagine the city sort of blindly groping forward into whatever future, will inevitably unfold. The city itself plays such a big role. It's almost like the city or the town in 100 Years of Solitude, or it's almost like Proust's Combray. I think this book is fantastic. I looked online quickly looking for like a review, and it doesn't seem like anyone's really covered this book or talked about it. And I've never been more sure in my life that I've read something that deserves more readership. This is, in my opinion, an absolute classic and should be read by everybody. I mean, it should have a way larger readership. I think Gregor von Rezzori in general deserves a way larger readership. And I've ordered his other books. I have one more currently on my shelf. This book was fantastic. After that, I read I Don't Care, stories by Ágota Kristóf, who I love. I love Ágota Kristóf, and I've read all of her works that are available in English. She has this really interesting perspective, being a Hungarian writer who was forced to emigrate to France and ended up being published and writing in France. So she has a lot of insight into the immigrant experience, this feeling of writing in a non-native tongue. Her kind of big trilogy, The Notebook, The Proof, and The Third Lie, I read a handful of years ago, and it really left a big impression on me as a reader. These are like earlier stories of hers that it's their first time being published in English, and there are all these little brief just pops of kind of bleak, I don't want to say dark, because they didn't give me the feeling of like she's not sort of wallowing in anything as she maybe does in some of her other books. She's really looking to sort of express something greater about her experience. And so knowing that these stories came before her other books really helped me put that in perspective. I don't know if this is the best place to start with Ágota Kristóf, but I think New Directions has been putting out, they put out her short memoir last year. She's great. These stories are really great. I read this in a day. That's Ágota Kristóf. I don't care. I finally finished my reading of Europe, A History by Norman Davies. I decided I wanted to read this book, and I made a commitment to read 10 pages every day. This book is over 1,000 pages, so I think I started this book in August, and it took me until the beginning of this month to finally finish. Davies is painting a history of Europe from its very beginnings to its like sort of modern understandings today, or he was writing this in like the early mid-90s. And so for him, there's a very clear progression from like these ancient civilizations into a larger Christendom, into our modern perceptions of Europe. And he does a really good job of laying it out. He includes all of these interesting like capsules. And so this one here is called Syphilis, and these ones are called, let's see, Madonna, where he's got these sort of like bits of information that help paint the picture of culture and fill in some of the gaps of what's happening in more detail beyond the broader scopes of history. And they're some of my favorite parts was reading those capsules, but they do sort of interrupt the flow of the reading experience. And in the introduction, he sort of like understands that might happen, and he's sort of like, yeah, like you can read them in any order you want. They do sort of come in context of the history, so I think it's beneficial to read all of them as you go in order. Going forward, I think this book will be a really good tool to refer to. The chapters are like 100 or so pages long, and if I do ever feel like, oh, I really want to read about the 14th century or whatever, using his chapter on that time as a reference as I'm looking at other texts is going to be really helpful, because he does do a lot of naming names and listing events sort of one after the other, but the context is clear. He's never too far away from the general thrust of what's going on. He doesn't get too bogged down in the nitty-gritty. This was really good, and I'm so happy I finished it. You can see all the edgeware on it. Like, I really spent a lot of time with this book. I followed that up with some more Jung, The Spirit in Man, Art and Literature. This edition from ARC Publishers, it's this really nice blue color with this Picasso painting, and he does talk about Picasso in here. These are sort of some of Jung's essays and speeches and lectures he's given on various literary figures and artists. So here's one on the two essays on Paracelsus, who I'd never heard about. One of them is a lecture where he goes into more detail, and the other one is more of a biographical sketch. He talks about his relationship with Freud and his memory of Freud, and this is a great resource for looking at sort of their differences in philosophy. Another one about Richard Wilhelm. Wilhelm was a translator, and so Jung is interested in specifically his translation of like Chinese works and the I Ching, I think, in particular. So learning about that was really interesting as well, and seeing the more sort of spiritual side of Jung. Perhaps the most interesting in sort of the broader scope of literature is Jung's writing about Ulysses, and there are descriptions in here of his letters and his exchanges with Joyce about Ulysses directly. Jung seemed to be like not a fan of the book, but sort of begrudgingly appreciative of what it accomplishes, and sort of it's a work that we as moderns need to wrestle with and understand and attempt to read. This was cool. It was a cool little edition. I don't know if it's necessarily essential Jung reading, but I got it at one of the book fairs here. I think it helps paint the picture, and I mean, especially the stuff with Freud and learning more about their specific differences. It was a handy little volume I was happy to get to. Following that, I read The Overstory by Richard Powers. This is my third Powers book. I read the Goldbug Variations last year and Galatea 2.2 2 years ago, and this might be my favorite one of his. It's an incredibly moving story about trees. And when you hear that description, or at least when I heard that description, I thought it was going to be a lot of like tree hugging stuff, which is in here. He's definitely, up to bat for the environmentalists, but he creates really wonderful characters, and the introduction where we learn about all these characters, and using the structure of a tree as a plot device to sort of bring these characters together and have them separate. Towards the end, I was feeling a little bit tired. I mean, this book is like 500 pages, but there are passages in here of pure brilliance, and I mean, it won the Pulitzer Prize for a reason. I think it's probably his most popular book, and maybe deservedly so. I think this is great. I think Powers is great. He's living American writers, got to be one of the best, and I'm looking forward to reading more of his stuff. I think because he won this award so recently, I guess in 2018 or 19, Japan decided to import a lot of his books, so they're on the shelves in the bookstores here pretty regularly, and I've been able to find a couple here and there at used bookstores, so I am intending to read a lot more of his books, and this one was a great addition, great fall book too. I've been truly inching towards reading more philosophy, and I think this month I sort of made a pretty big step in that direction. I've been interested, but actually getting into the text has been kind of a challenge. I found this book in one of the book offs for like 200 yen. This is The Seducer's Diary by Kierkegaard. This book is an extract from Either Or. I decided this would be a good place to start if I wanted to see what he was all about. This is kind of a narrative. It's sort of like a novelistic experiment, a thought experiment of almost like an intentional gaslighting of a young woman. This book was written in the wake of like the collapse of Kierkegaard's engagement, sort of famously fell apart, and spent a lot of time dwelling on it. And so kind of in like maybe like a recompense or a way of processing everything, he sort of went to the farthest extreme of how wretched he felt himself to be. It's kind of based in truth, but it seems to be mostly fictionalized account of an older man who ingratiates himself into the life of a girl he sees and decides he's going to toy with her life and have her as a kind of an emotional and romantic plaything. He sets up another man to be her fiance and intentionally tears that apart. He becomes close to the girl's relatives and family, and it's almost like Lolita, but without the fetishizing of a young woman. It's more of like taking pleasure in the process of capturing in itself. I think it was interesting, and definitely you can see like his philosophy on love and where a lot of his existential ideas are coming from. I think it was okay. I liked it, and I want to read more of his stuff, his more famous works, someday soon. I read Fording the Stream of Consciousness by Dubravka Ugrešić, and this is one of these writings from an Unbound Europe series, which I really like, from Northwestern University Press. Ugrešić was a Croatian writer, or a Yugoslav writer, who unfortunately passed last year, and her works are this really cool postmodern style. She writes a lot of essays and stuff set in this collapse of the Soviet Union, and this book in particular takes place at a literary conference. She sort of uses this plot device of like a diary, all these small entries of like trying to write about anything at all, but then she goes into details of this literary conference and the different people who attend from different nations. There's this sort of utter failure to communicate, and this attempt at creating like a unified vision of European literature, but it's totally impossible because of how separate and distinct the cultures are. There's all this like failure to assimilate with each other. It's getting bright. I'm going to close my window. So this literary conference plays out over a couple days. There's like literary espionage and postmodern hijinks. There are sections of exchanging literary trivia a la David Markson, and the whole thing paints a really funny picture for me. In my life as a reader, postmodernism had sort of like come and gone as like something I was really interested in. It was almost a little passé, and I was looking for something a little different, but this really reignited a lot of my passion for postmodern stuff, the stuff that got me interested in reading it in the first place. And she does circle back around to those diary entries at the end. These numbers, I wanted to check if they correlate to how many paragraphs there are in the book, but I did not feel like counting up to 1,000. And it's got to be more than 1,000, right? So I'm wondering what these numbers are all about. I then read The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony by Roberto Calasso. And Calasso is this sort of figure, this literary figure I'm super interested in. Kind of a polymath, linguist, philosopher, mythologist guy who also passed recently. And his big body of work is kind of an attempt to understand the entire scope of European culture. Where does it come from, and where are all of its sources, and how has it played out over 2,000 years? The first book in that series is The Ruin of Cache, which is ostensibly about Talleyrand, the French politician and associate of Napoleon, sort of a figure bridging the gap between pre- and post-revolutionary France. But it's also about mythology and kind of everything. It goes really, really broad. And so it seems like from this book, Calasso sort of understood he had to break everything down even more. So this book deals entirely with the Greek myths. He goes through a great deal of stories from the Greek mythology, reinterpreting them or laying them out in such a way that we can see directly how they affect our society and how civilization changed from the time of these mythologies to present day, or even just within Greece from the age of the heroes to the age of Socrates. This is kind of the key question for Calasso in this book, is where does this period of heroes and gods end, and where does this period of man begin, and what causes that to happen? So in telling all of these stories, he's looking for all of these signs and the different attributes of the gods and the heroes that show a more humanizing aspect. You can see I put like a billion flags in here. There's like a super good insight on almost every page in this book. Let me see if I can find something. As an example here, the necklace, the crown, the garland. As the years passed, the leaves and petals of beauty fell away, leaving only the cold fetter of the circle, unadorned necessity, and what once had given rise to whole cycles of stories, the Theban cycle, the Trojan cycle, now shrank back into the stuff of commonplace crime, where the protagonists remain nameless, and only the bare events are remembered. An elopement, a murder, in a Greece that had nothing to look forward to now but its capitulation to Alexander and wanted only to forget the past. But all of this, and no less than this, was of the nature of the crown, the necklace, the garland. This image of the circle really plays a big role in the book as a kind of key symbol. So this series expands from here and goes out. I think there may be 10 more books following this one. The next one deals more specifically with Vedic myths and like sort of Indian mythology. It's called Ka. And his books are also widely underread, in my opinion. I mean, this one was put out from Vintage International. So was Ka, the Follower. So I guess these ones had decent readership at one point, but I believe it took until recently just to translate all of them into English. So that's The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony by Roberto Calasso. I also read The Maimed by Hermann Ungar. Ungar was a Bohemian writer in the 20s and 30s. He was also like a diplomat of some sort. He worked in like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Education, something like that. And he also wrote a couple of novels and plays. What sold me on this book from the beginning, besides this this cool edition from Twisted Spoon Press with this nice green paper and all these illustrations. These illustrations are by Pavel Roth. What sold me on this book originally was I saw this pamphlet in the front, the sort of reviews, and one of them is from Thomas Mann and one of them is from Stefan Zweig, and that's an odd, maybe it's not that odd, but it's a pair I'd never seen together before. The book is about a man who is incredibly neurotic, and this neuroses definitely comes from sort of sexual insecurities and questioning sexual preference, and he's got some trauma in the past from a bit of an assault. He's grown up into this man that we would say has like a severe OCD. Everything really needs to be in its place and on time, and change at all throws everything out of whack for him. But he ends up being caught in this sort of conspiracy of corruption by his landlord and his friend, who is in, he's recovering in a sanitarium from some sort of undefined illness that has left him incapacitated. He is constantly paranoid that everyone is watching him and criticizing him. Compared to Kafka, who I think is like a natural point of comparison, the sort of neuroses and the way that the outside world is affecting the character on the inside, it's far less clear that all of this isn't in his head. It seems like these people are either conspiring against him or genuinely hoping to support him, and it constantly fluctuates, and Ungar does a really good job of keeping you off guard. And there's a nice little appendix or fragment, and this fragment is kind of I'm not quite sure why it's not part of the main text. It really does give a nice ending to it. I know this book has been compared to like David Lynch. It's quite Lynchian, and I can see that too. It was kind of cool, and I breezed through it. It's kind of it's a bit of a page turner. It was easy for me to keep going for whatever reason. That's the Maimed. Following that, I read Orlando by Virginia Woolf. I'd been dying to get to this book. I really like Virginia Woolf, and for some reason Orlando's always stood out to me as something I wanted to read. And it's totally different from Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, which are the other ones I've read. It's this sort of imaginary biography of a British, a young lord who, for one reason or another, is able to live hundreds of years, and in the process of this life, famously changes genders. Outside of the more sort of famous plot points of the gender change and the long life, this book is kind of ultimately about an attempt to write, to create something in writing, or to find a way to express oneself, express one's love for nature, express one's love for another in writing. It becomes this sort of thing that is being chased throughout the book. Of course, it has Woolf's humor as well, and the book is filled with literary figures from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Because it's like a biography, it gives Woolf like license to give this really charming, omniscient narrative voice that's kind of winking at you throughout the book. It allows her to emphasize certain details and skip other details. There's really great stuff in here about, of course, gender. There's great stuff in here about color and nature. The famous scene where Orlando declares, "I'm nature's bride," and then nature throws a spouse literally in front of her. It reminded me a bit of Hermann Hesse's Narcissus and Goldmund, the sort of figure existing in a space, and the culture is sort of piling up on top of them and changing their view, but in the end they're sort of pursuing something that is never going to be theirs. I was hoping for more of Woolf's sort of stream of consciousness modernism, and you get a really great section of that in the end. The ending of this book I couldn't put down, maybe the last 50 or 60 pages, the last chapter, I suppose. And of course, this whole thing sort of being a characterization of Rita Sackville West, and Woolf sort of, it's sort of like a love letter, but it's also, kind of throwing some shade. But that relationship is really intricate and involved, and I don't know too much about it, but I'd like to read more. Woolf's one of my favorite writers, and this whole period is very interesting to me, so I was really happy to finally read Orlando. Another step on my philosophy journey. I'm really making an intention to read more philosophy and try to understand. And I read The Phenomenon of Man by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. This book came to my attention, I think, from when I was reading Annie Dillard, maybe in connection with Wholly the Firm. I really like Dillard, and I really like her perspective and her writing, so hearing a book like this influenced her. Immediately I was intrigued. Teilhard de Chardin's whole point here, his whole main thesis, is that life and consciousness has been growing from the beginning of time onward, and outside of the accepted scientific idea of complexification in nature and in organisms, there's also a increasing complexity of consciousness. So this complexity consciousness growth over time. Ultimately, what he's aiming for is this omega point, this next evolution of life that goes beyond man and goes beyond thought. Inherent in this, he's talking about how in every being, in living matter, in non-living matter, in atoms and molecules, there is the without that we sort of see physically expressed, and there is the within. Within ourselves, it's our mind. But as we go back down the tree of life, we have to assume that an interiority exists in everything. And so this must be true all the way back into, protozoa and inanimate life and atoms. There must be some sort of interiority. So he calls this the within, or he calls it radial energy. And so assuming this, he goes from the beginning of the creation of the universe and the very first molecules and atoms, and lays out an entire progression of how they have developed in this sort of trial and error groping to grow and become more complex, and how this is the sort of inevitable nature of everything, is this sort of growing and complexifying. And when we get to living matter, this growth becomes more of an effort to almost humanize, to become more human. And when we get to humanity, there's this threshold of reflection, which is a phrase he repeats a lot in the book. This threshold of reflection, where reflection is the ability that humans have that other creatures don't. And this has allowed all of our interiority to grow, and our ideas, our dreams, our loves, and things like that. As our knowledge has grown and our ability to place ourselves in the universe via this ability to reflect has sort of become more clear, to Teilhard de Chardin, it becomes even more clear that this progression is going to continue onward into something that we can't possibly imagine, but it exists in outside space and time, and it is sort of this ultimate goal of life. I think that's cool. I think his thesis, he makes it very clear in the introduction and the foreword what his thesis is. And so because the thesis is so strong and so clear, all of the details that sort of build into it, by the end, they're almost like self-evident. You're sort of like, oh yeah, of course that must be, right? So I find myself agreeing, or not necessarily agreeing, but certainly being intrigued by these ideas. And a lot of them seem to make good sense to me. Although projecting farther into the future is something I feel less confident in, and especially because he was writing this in the late 30s, early 40s, with a little appendix written after the Second World War. I'd be curious to see his thoughts on, for example, the internet and social media and AI, right? How does that play in? perhaps there's a study of this book with all those things in mind that would shed some light on that. Of course, the thing that's sort of bubbling under the surface here is that Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit priest, and he lays out this entire argument for this progression onward to an omega point beyond humanity, and then at the end, he lets you know, by the way, Christianity is sort of a prime way of expressing this reality and seeing this come to fruition. He doesn't really spend time proselytizing on, Christ as the Son of God or whatever, but he sort of says that, like, in terms of community and in terms of sort of the instantiation and communion and things like that, it's very clear that his ideas are emerging from Christianity. And so, I don't know, I mean, I wonder if Christianity is different than it was 75, 80 years ago. I wonder how he would feel writing about Christianity today, for example. And maybe, he's just sort of using Christianity as an example because it already exists and has existed, but I don't think he's necessarily denying that another religion or some sort of structure like that could take Christianity's place. So this book it's classified as philosophy, religion. I think spirituality would maybe be more fair, but considering his profession, he's a paleontologist priest, which is pretty far out. But there is some Christian stuff sort of in here throughout. But that goes back to Dillard as well. This sort of spiritual Christianity is, not necessarily convincing to me, but certainly fascinating. Lastly, I read First Person Singular Stories by Haruki Murakami. And of course, I've got a history reading Haruki Murakami. I love reading. I live in Japan. It's kind of inevitable, right? There's definitely a time when I would have said Murakami was my favorite writer. My tastes have totally changed, where now I feel like these books are kind of like, it's kind of literary junk food for me. I mean, just flipping through this book, the margins are really big and the font's really big, and the stories play out almost in like a Murakami by numbers type way, where it's almost inevitable that, there's music and there's strange old men dispensing vague wisdom. There are self-insert characters that allow him to explore things he's interested in. The whole conceit of this book is that the stories are all written in the first person singular. They're good. They're good for what they are. I think Murakami's stories have always been good. I think I've never had beef with any of his stories. Some of his novels I've been straight up absolutely not. I dislike this book intensely. But his stories have always been either, good or interesting or enjoyable, somewhere in that sort of mix. And I think these ones are as well. If you're a Murakami fan, you sort of know what to expect, and these ones deliver. It's also got this really cool inner cover, kind of like a fake jazz record, and this is based off of one of the stories in here. So there's that. I read, I think, 12 books in November, which is a pretty wild month for me. I think I need to slow down a little bit.